The key message throughout the morning will be the need to work across sectors and to work collaboratively. And that same message comes out in all sorts of different research in other clinical samples. And one particular group, the men's behaviour change group, just to divert a bit, but that key message around the tipping point for change is when the system works together, has come out in major research around the world, and particularly Gondolf's research. They had over 800 men and families where there'd been family violence. And those men who were most able to change, it was where they'd received a joined-up message from the courts, from the police, from women's services, from the schools, from children's services. So the synergy of people working together, the research brought out what we already knew really clinically, and that is if you work together, you'll get that tipping point for change. The other bit of good news from that research was that it's actually very effective. 80% of the men with the multi-systemic approach actually stopped the violence within 6 months. And that research was very important, I think. So, we talk about the need to create safer communities for children. And I think the inspiration from coming together today is powerful, because it is when you all come together to think about what harm does to children, and we're going to show you some sort of graphic descriptions of that during the day. It's a no-brainer that we've got to get into the preventative space and to get into the early intervention. And that's what has made me so passionate these last few years working and made me want to come and work within the department to work towards that approach that was actually mindful of cumulative harm of children. And the invitation was there actually to build that culture of reflective practice and to bring people together to think about how we're working with families with complex problems, and how we work with the little 3-year-old, how we work with the 8-year-old who's not got any friends at school and who's smelly and never getting any invites to parties, and who can't even speak about what happened last night because they haven't got the words for it, they're so overwhelmed, and who might be sitting there at school daydreaming because they're actually dissociating, they're so traumatised. So how do we actually work with children, and maybe the 9-year-old brother of that 8-year-old who's running amok and has been described as feral and probably got ADHD, everybody thinks, but in fact when you get him one-to-one, or when he's doing music or when he's doing sport, he can concentrate beautifully. And in fact, nobody's yet asked the questions around what's going on and why mum is looking so depressed, and how we might actually engage the parents differently. So I am passionate about the need to be trauma-informed, to actually understand child development a bit more, and to be thinking about that as educators. My husband's actually a teacher and a secondary school principal now, and actually worked in Indigenous education with the Dare to Lead program, and there's so much we can do within education, and often it is so simple. The simple things and the welcome and the honouring Aboriginal culture can make such a difference in the school environment. So I will be talking about Protecting Victoria's Vulnerable Children Inquiry 2012 a bit this morning. I'm nervous now with this thing, if it's going to go Burko again. Who are the clients of modern child protection services? Well, actually, we're not working with the worried well. The small group who actually come into child protection in Victoria generally have multiple and complex needs. And recent research has shown that they typically have 5 or more disadvantages, including, and this is again the common sort of presentation, living with poverty, unemployment, poor quality housing and disabilities. So there's a whole literature now around social exclusion and how we can make a difference for these children by being inclusive. The saddest story I heard from my husband recently was of a kid who was shamed because he didn't have the money to go get on the bus for the school excursion, and because he knew what was happening in the home. And the very kid who needed to get on that bus and go on that excursion to have that experience, he wasn't getting the holidays like the other kids were. He didn't have the same enriched environment at home. And that sort of, without thinking, people acting in ways that were deeply humiliating for that boy because he didn't have the money to get on the bus. So sometimes it's the littlest things that make the biggest difference for kids, and how unwittingly as a system sometimes we can make such a difference to harm or to heal. And so all of you who are there that run breakfast programs, who work behind the scenes getting clean clothes for kids at school, and who make sure no child is shamed because there's money that's found for kids to go on camps whose parents can't afford it. I just want to pat you all on the back and say, you know, you are doing amazing work. We know in Victoria, the Ellen Consulting Group in 2002 had the clearest data, and it continued this trend, that family violence, substance abuse and mental illness are the commonly co-occurring difficulties for families. So this is the unholy trio, we call it, or the trifecta. The Victorian Child Death Review Committee, again and again, reports the same sort of prevalence. And I've been on that committee now, it's my 10th year. And I think to sit on that committee where cases where there have been deaths of children known to child protection. Now, just to clarify, most of the children that die are actually dying from SIDS or complex medical issues. They're not dying as a result of fatal neglect or child abuse, although some do. But what it does do is give an opportunity for an in-depth review that's rigorous around the practice and across the lifetime of those children. And having done that for a few years, it can give you a fire in the belly to want to get in there and make a difference to how we practice now within child protection. So we've had huge reform, really since 2002, when we realised that churn of the same families coming into child protection was around 62% of notifications were in fact re-notifications. And there was this huge focus on episodic assessment or immediate harm. And the new legislation that you'd all be aware of that came about in 2005, enacted in 2007, was really a huge shift. And that Children, Youth and Families Act in 2007 enabled us to actually put towards the court an argument that talked about the cumulative harm to the child. For the first time, that was in the legislation, the words cumulative harm. So it's not a new grounds for a protection application, but it was noted there purposefully so that we wanted magistrates to take note that children are exponentially affected by the multiple disadvantages. And neglect of children is just as important as the bruise. And that was often misunderstood. So it's common to find parents also with disabilities, with acquired brain injury, and also their own history of early childhood trauma. And how do we help children to not bear the brunt of their parents' unresolved pain and their own unresolved trauma? And any of you working in drug and alcohol will know substance abuse is generally medicating some sort of unresolved issue. Most people don't get addictions unless there's some pain that is so bad they have to block it out. What's the anaesthetic for? And we all know the harm that does then in families and to children. There were 55,000 reports to child protection in 10-11. We've seen a growth, frightening growth, from 49% increase from 2000. And now that's huge, and I don't need to explain to you that the growth in child protection practitioners has not been the same, although thankfully we have had some increase. What we do know is that compared to other states, though, we're actually quite fortunate, can I say that? Because other states have had, 500% increase, 1,000% increase. Like some of the other states are absolutely sort of buckling. Now, the difference, and in round 07, our growth comparatively was way smaller. And we've had a lot of interest from other states in Australia and also internationally about how come we've been able to maintain a lower growth compared to other states. And I think it's because of good people like you that are prepared to be sensible and not become territorial, get out of your silos and work across systems for families. The big shift, though, was the introduction of integrated family services and the Child First, where we had joined up intakes at a local level. And there are 24 catchments now in Victoria of child first communities. And I think that's been a huge shift. The other big change was putting community-based child protection practitioners within those teams. And I think that was a really important act, where we actually had people talking across sectors and trying to look at those families, because when I show you some stats, you'll actually see that although we've had a growth in reports, the growth in substantiations nowhere matches it. So a lot of those families coming in to child protection are actually needing support, not generally a forensic assessment. Does that make sense? The legislation is very clear. Under the best interest principles, we have to give the widest possible assistance to the family. So we're in deep concern when we have to take any matter to the Children's Court. So 70% of children subject to a report into child protection in 9-10 had previously been, though, the subject of a report or were subsequently re-reported to child protection in 10 or 11. So that's a lot. Okay, 70% of children subject to a report had actually been re-reported. So we've still got this issue of the same families. Now sometimes that's unavoidable because we've intervened and then things have got better. Then the family's gone on for a few years and then something happens. Someone gets out of jail, somebody is triggered into a traumatic state, the mum gets on the substance abuse again, and then we're needing to re-report. So it's not always a bad thing, but it's a significant issue, and it's one that we need to look at as communities. How can we actually stop that churn? 2,000 of those children, though, were subject of more than 10 reports to date over their lifetime. Now that can't be good. Aboriginal children are around 10 times more likely to be the subject of substantiated abuse and neglect. Now that's substantiated, that's not reports. So that's a really significant figure. And around half of all the children for whom abuse was found to be substantiated had been victims of abuse earlier in their lives. Now that's significant. Every week, nearly 60 children come into care. The number of children and young people placed in out-of-home care has increased by 46% over the past decade. Now, like I said, we are the lowest in Australia, and actually we have the lowest rate of children in out-of-home care in the Western world, next to Japan. Okay, so if you sized up all the UK, the US, all those countries, Victoria, not Australia, Australia is a higher, where Australia sits about in the middle, but Victoria, if you drill into our stats, around that 4.6 per thousand of population, we're the lowest in the Western world. But we know the outcomes for children in out-of-home care, compared to other kids, are often very poor. So it's a huge issue. And Dorothy Scott spoke on Friday last week at the Australian Institute of Family Studies and reminded us all that the risk of harm to children in out-of-home care is there. The iatrogenic sequelae of children, the unintended consequences, if you like, when children go into care are serious. And we need to be much more thoughtful about how we're working with children in out-of-home care. And to that end, we've done lots and lots of work, and I know up here we've had the therapeutic pilot, so some of you working in out-of-home care will know this well, but others I'll just speak for it for a minute because you might not know. We've been really clear that the whole understanding around trauma has to really be deeply understood by those caring for our most vulnerable kids. So we've worked really hard to be training residential care workers and foster carers to understand the impact of trauma, and to know that we've got to work differently, that the same old behavioural modification approaches just don't cut it with kids when they've been traumatised. And I know George will talk a lot more about that this afternoon. But in a nutshell, when a child's traumatised and they're coming in and they're displaced and they're scared and they're frightened, they're going to be particularly sensitive to wanting to have control. Because when you're traumatised, you're pinned down, you're done too, you've got no sense of control. And there's a whole process of being overwhelmed and not having words for it, and the memories going somewhere else, and your body being stuck in that fight-flight. And when kids live in that, they're often really difficult in the education setting. Literally fight-flight. They're not paying attention, they're out of there, they're daydreaming, dissociative, or they're running amok and often creating chaos, because that's in effect, paradoxically, almost like a comfortable position, because that's what they've grown up with. And they'll be okay as long as they can control the thing. When they're told no, that's when you'll get the triggered effect and they'll act out. So to help resi carers particularly, who are dealing with the most traumatised kids often, the adolescents in care, and there's only about 500 of them in the state in residential care. Okay, the rest are in home-based care or permanent placements. What we do, and the biggest group of carers in Victoria is actually kinship carers. So the whole policy direction has been to place wherever possible children within their kith and kin networks. And much better, of course, for sense of identity. And we do have the Aboriginal Child Placement Principle enshrined in legislation, which very clearly sets out that family and community have to be the first options that we explore, that we want to hold children where they can't be with their parents. So we know that it's not just about resources, it's about how we train people, how people react to kids, how they don't escalate, how they understand that actually these kids need time in with deep engagement with compassionate adults who also have common sense about boundaries. Because a trauma-informed approach doesn't mean you just let them do whatever they feel like. It actually means you understand their core need for attachment and that their trust has been really betrayed. So they really struggle to trust any other adult. And if you know what's happened to some of these kids, you'd be thinking, God, it's more a miracle they give any of us a go, really. So that issue of trust and attachment has often been really, really affected in those early years. So it's not surprising that it gets played out in all sorts of other contexts, both in care, in the classroom, at daycare, etc., at school. So we've trained about 1,400 resi carers around the state, thanks to Berry Street and Westcare, with this thing called With Care, it's called, the name. So it's all about understanding trauma and all of this. We've brought together all the heads of the out-of-home care agencies, and they were all trained, the top managers. We brought out a group from the US called the Sanctuary Model people, and they trained us in organisational change, saying that you can't just train your people on the ground working with the kids. You've got to have organisations, top down, that understand trauma and that will work with staff differently to support them. We set up pilots around the state, around 14 pilots around the state, to actually help those kids most in need. There were extra staff at night, because that's when we understand trauma. We know that kids will get intrusive thoughts and memories, flashbacks, more at night time than anywhere else. So quiet times and night times are the two key points. So there's the need, though, to support your carers and to have clinical staff, trained people who can support the carers to make sense of that kid who I've spent so much time with, and then she just spat at me and called me an effing so-and-so, and I've done this and this and this. So that for staff to actually learn to weather that in a different way and to have an understanding about why the young person's acting like that. Thankfully, we've had a really good evaluation of that over the last 4 years. Now, not surprisingly, the results have been pretty stunning. The independent KPMG evaluations available on the net, but in a nutshell, the sort of killer stats, 200% greater positive outcomes for these kids and 100% decrease in negative outcomes, including assaults on other staff, on other kids, and admissions to secure welfare. And that included school attendance, those 200% increase. So we know what works, and we were able then to convince government to actually fund, and we've had a very effective minister. She convinced Treasury to fund another 100 beds around the state over the next 4 years. So that's really encouraging. If you look at, oh God, it did it again. If you look at the child deaths in 2005 to 2010, and I'll get back there really fast, we know that there were missed opportunities for early planning coordination. That's a theme that comes up again and again. There was an absence of integration and multi-systemic approaches. And the child-focused services alone cannot develop effective plans to safeguard children. This was the clear message. So what the Cummins report has come out with is something, in fact, that's been out there in lots of other reports, but it's been a stronger sort of authorising work, I think, to come out and say it much more powerfully. But those child death reports year after year have been saying the same thing, that you need specialist and adult-focused services dealing with adult substance abuse and adult mental health to become aware of children, and that their clients are in fact parents. And I think you're way ahead up here in the northeast. I know I've been to other conferences and heard the No Wrong Doors, the joined up services between substance abuse services and adult mental health. So I think you can be teaching the rest of the state actually, because you know this from the inside, and you've got some really innovative things happening up here that I'm aware of. But that notion that it's everybody's business has been a key finding. Oh, it worked. We need then partnerships in protecting and caring for children, and coordination and collaboration, and that child-focused services just can't do it alone. Now, some of you, the thing you might have seen, first of all, about the Cummins inquiry were the headlines like this. And interestingly, the church, sexual abuse within the church has actually got the most publicity. Those of us working in the field actually, whilst that is incredibly important, and I've certainly worked in that area over the years, in terms of the prevalence rates though, it's intrafamilial sexual abuse that's right up here. That for children being sexually abused, it's generally by a known and trusted person. And generally, we know most children don't disclose in childhood. There's no research around the world that says it's normative for children to disclose in childhood. What's normative is that children keep the secret. And if it's your dad, if it's your uncle, your grandfather, whatever, it is absolutely like breaking the rules to talk about what happens because everyone else thinks he's terrific. And who'd believe me anyway? And you might well have been threatened, and you might have a dissociative response when the abuse is happening, and you might actually really love the person as well. You don't like what they're doing, but you love all the rest of them. And kids compartmentalise in order to cope, and so they shut up and put up. So the whole complexity of sexual abuse dynamics within families is something that we're trying to do a lot of work with, and particularly within the legal sector, because it's often counterintuitive. People expect children, if they've been abused, to run a mile from the perpetrator. We've got cases we're appealing in the Supreme Court at the moment because the child is wanting to go back to the offending parent, has retracted their original disclosures of the sexual abuse, and say, no, I want to go back to daddy, I want to go back to daddy. Mum said she did believe in now, and mum says, no, that worker made it up, and So we've got these terrible situations where the child is actually seeking proximity, if you like, wanting to go back home to the offender. Now that's counterintuitive, isn't it? But that's the reality, and for those of us working with children, it's very important that you understand those complex family dynamics. This is some of the other headlines that happened after the Cummins inquiry. We had Dorothy Scott, Philip Cummins, who chaired it, and Bill Scales. And there was a whole team of people that worked with them for a year. And their terms of reference were broad, which was good. It included the prevention and early intervention, the quality of family services, statutory child protection and out-of-home care, the role of the Children's Court. So those of you would remember we'd had two ombudsman's reports. So we've had a lot of focus. Now the irony was, whilst there were still obvious gaps in the system and cases where mistakes had been made, comparatively, and this obviously didn't get the media attention, comparatively we were doing very well on our earlier intervention, prevention and the out-of-home care, like I've just explained before. And what we've also been very strongly doing within child protection has been trying to provide more clinical support. So the whole introduction of the principal practitioner, which was myself and then George, was the second, and then now we've got 8, one in each region, and you're about to have a new person start who's terrific. Fellow John Mixford is coming across to work within children, youth and families within the department in the Hume region. We've also got 2 statewide, and we've got an office now with practice advisors. We've got somebody co-located down with the sex offender registry. We're about to get 2 new staff to work in the family court, one in Dandenong, one in Melbourne. We've got somebody who does a whole lot of information exchange with corrections. So what we've done is tried to really support the direct casework, the assessment processes, information gathering. So there's been a whole lot of work to strengthen that. The final report contains 90 recommendations. Now this is the Cummins report, ranging across 6 government departments. 20 findings and 14 matters for attention. So I wonder it took 900 pages. It does recommend extensive and far-reaching changes to Victoria's current system for protecting children. Now, what's really critical, though, is that it took a much more systemic and community-based approach, saying education's got to play a role here, health has to play a role, Department of Premier and Cabinet. So what it did across government was saying these children, these vulnerable families, are the whole of government's responsibility, not just Department of Human Services. And we shouldn't be waiting for children to fall into the narrow sort of eye of the needle of child protection in order to get a good service. We need to get in there earlier. And ask any principal of a school, any maternal and child health nurse, and they'll usually know who are the most vulnerable families. So the key change, mind you, the integrated family services and that outreach approach that family services were charged with, there were quite clear changes to the role and the expectations of family services that they would in fact outreach to the most vulnerable and prioritise the most vulnerable in communities. The nature and incidence of vulnerability for children and young people and their families, and this is again just a bit of a snapshot, but you can see that 49% increase from 2000 to 2011, and more than half of the children subject to a report in 0910 had previously been the subject of a report. So this is from the material gathered by the Cummins inquiry. Now look at the vulnerability concentrated in specific geographic areas and look at the rural issues here. You can see Hume. Okay, now the dark green represents the number of reports, and the light green column represents the number of substantiations. That's where there's been a child protection assessment, investigation, and the concerns have been substantiated. So you can see you've got high numbers here in Hume. Here we go to Aboriginal children and young people. And as Deb so eloquently pointed out, the history is not past. Stolen gen affects most Aboriginal families today. They did some research through DEECD and looked at the state of Victorian Aboriginal young people and children. Over half of them had a direct contact, a relative who'd been directly impacted by stolen gen. And the rest would be impacted through community and through friendship networks. More than 3 times the rate of stressful events than non-Indigenous families. So we need to actually acknowledge we need specific and community-based support for Aboriginal families. And I think those of you working in education, you know, you are doing amazing work, because that's often a way you can engage and build on those strengths that are there. Again, the report focused on the importance of preventing child abuse and neglect. And over and over, you know, again and again, that point of statutory services alone cannot be enough. will never be enough. And that was the argument, interestingly enough, before mandatory reporting. And I was working in inner urban at the time, late 80s. And there was a big push, actually, not to have mandatory reporting, because that would actually take away the community services and the community's responsibility for protecting all children. That it was actually everybody's responsibility. This slide actually shows you the tertiary, early intervention and secondary and tertiary services. But again, the critique was, and this is the Cummins critique, that early intervention programs are effective in improving outcomes for vulnerable children and young people, but that they do not come together to form a comprehensive, coherent and coordinated system. Well, you're showing them up here, aren't you? One of the key things we did actually recently was to provide funding for a specifically trained person on early childhood development to work with the family child first networks, integrated family services networks. And those positions, those people did fantastic work, and we saw a huge increase in referrals to early children's services and childcare, good quality childcare and early childhood programs. It exponentially increased. And that's where we had somebody working within family services to help them to know the networks within early children's services. So we do know that systems need help in talking across those program boundaries. We know that the government agencies are responsible for working together, and they must accept their responsibility to vulnerable children and to be held accountable. So we're having very interesting conversations at the moment with senior people in education and talking about the need to be co-parents to those children in out-of-home care particularly, and that we need targeted responses from schools and a joined-up response. Now this slide's a really busy one, but it actually shows you, and I'm happy to give this out, and if you're interested in the history, you can read it later on, but see the growth in reports, and you can see the different events that was happening across those years. You can see the spike in mandatory reporting, for example. And what we're talking about here, the whole point of this is the need to address the underlying causes of vulnerability for children and their families. And again, it came back to the key things that they found: the history of family violence, alcohol and other substance misuse, mental health problems, intellectual disability, and situational stress. The key factors that impinge on children who end up being reported to child protection. This slide actually shows you that small inner group, at any one time we have 5,700 children in out-of-home care. That's that centre group. But many, many more in that wider circle who are living with an unhealthy family functioning. And as people who've worked in the system a long time, it's any of us are only one or two steps away. You have enough converging difficult situations, protective factors that get lost, support people from the family move on, another baby's born, a new partner comes into some of those, the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and people end up being reported to child protection. Have a look at this. Look at the rates. Whilst we have an increase in expenditure, and that's across government, in 2003, research found that 1 in 5 children born that year would be subject of a report at some stage in their lives. But by 2011, this number's now increased to 1 in 4. So what's come out of the whole Cummins inquiry has been a range of things, but there's Victoria's Vulnerable Children, Our Shared Responsibility, is the paper that was released in May this year. And the Victorian Government, quote, is committed to system-wide reform and improvements that aim to prevent child abuse and neglect, reduce the impact when it does occur, and improve the outcomes for children and young people in the statutory child protection system. So that report, I don't know whether any of you have seen that, but that has recommendations across 5 main areas. And those areas are... says she nervously. Introducing accountability and transparency. Enhancing education and building capacity. Making a child-friendly legal system. So there's a whole lot of work going to happen over the next 10 years. Okay, the plan for children in out-of-home care is currently being developed across government, and that will be for the next 5 years. Building connected and effective services, well, that's starting now, but this plan, this blueprint, if you like, will be over the next 10 years, and providing safe, stable and supportive out-of-home care. So out of all those recommendations from Cummins, this joined up cross-government committee has narrowed it down to these 5 sort of key areas. Now, already we have multidisciplinary centres in 3 areas of Victoria that bring together the police, child protection, CASA workers and health workers for those children where there's been sexual abuse. They're called multidisciplinary centres, or SAYET. Some of you might be aware of the Socket members. The Socket police are now trained to be doing work with victims and detectives so they can be doing the work with the offender. Trying to develop, and they have, I think, achieved this, a much more victim-sensitive response to sexual assault. We've actually got funding for 3 new ones of those, so that'll make 6 around the state, and that's a really good thing. We know the quality of the planning, the preparation and the work has been markedly different where we've had these multidisciplinary centres. A whole-of-government approach to alcohol and drug strategy, and that is huge. If you look at the prevalence of alcohol and drug problems, it is huge. And where you have parents with these chronically sort of relapsing and often intractable problems, it's, devastating for children. And kids learn to adapt and accommodate as best they can. But we do need to get all of those adults-focused services much more focused on children. And that's happening. Those conversations, I think, have been happening the last few years, but we need to do more of it. And the whole of government action plan to address violence against women and their children. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Again, this doesn't come out of the blue. Many of you would be part of local networks and where there's memorandums of understanding and protocols with police, family violence, child protection, and men's and women's services. And so we've been working the last few years. We've got the CRAF now, the Common Risk Assessment Framework. There's a new document about assessing children that's using all the child protection sort of knowledge inside that. We've got away from blaming mothers for being, failing to protect, and that sort of, analysis that lacked an understanding of power and violence, towards a much greater sense that women are victims too in these relationships, and how do we actually engage them and not shame them? But how do we actually hold the child in mind as you do that? And how do you actually get them to think about the impact of on the baby? They say, no, the baby was asleep in another room when it was happening. And I'm going to show you some DVD in a minute that'll actually let you know that in fact the impact on the baby is huge. And it's a nonsense to think that because children are small that they're not being impacted. So the need to join up across the family violence sector and the children's sector and child protection is huge, and family services. So if you talk to anyone working in family services, generally I get about 70 to 80% of the families you're working with have drug and alcohol and family violence issues. Would that be right up here? Yeah, 70, 80% around there? Yeah. So, in family services and child protection, we're not working with the worried well. We're working with complex issues. And again, those workers in those fields need to be really skilled up and need to know who they can call on to access that sort of support. Adult mental health is a huge area. We actually need to have support around understanding the impact of the mental illness on the parenting. Not just to know that, oh, the mother's no longer florid and her symptoms have stabilised. Well, is she flat as a tack? Is she interacting with the baby, or is the baby in the cot all day? Okay, so people who have adverse childhood experiences have a much greater risk of poor health outcomes, poor mental health outcomes, relationship breakdown, ending up in jail. It goes on. And that's a graded response. So that ACE study, we haven't got enough time to go into that today, but by Folletti and others, actually documents that, and they had thousands, about 12,000 participants in that research. It's powerful. And that information, I think, across governments is making a difference. That if we can teach children to read, literally, there'll be fewer people ending up in jail. And if you cost out what all of those services take, compared to the little you need to spend in early childhood and the lifelong return, it's a compelling argument. So with this New Directions paper, what they've actually decided to fund greater perinatal emotional health programs, and that's been extended to metropolitan Melbourne. There's also a reform to student support services, so some of you from education will be interested in that, including a new online case management system. There's new teacher training to increase capacity of school to support vulnerable children with challenging behaviours. And I'm sure we'll be talking later about the calmer classrooms and other resources that we've developed. I've got some resources here today, if those of you who haven't got it, called Child Development and Trauma, and helping you to actually understand what the indicators are. There's also, for the Future Directions paper, we've been alerted to reforms coming to maternal and child health as part of a new Memorandum of Understanding with the local government. A whole of government project to streamline services for vulnerable young children aged 0 to 4. And DEECD actually has the lead on that 0 to 4 strategy. So that's interesting. And work to reform the community services organisation sector to ensure adequate capacity and quality. So there's in each of your sectors, you will be hearing much more about this vulnerable children's strategy, as it's called. There's also plans to make a child-friendly legal system and to develop a new court in the Broadmeadows area. We've been working really hard building bridges with the Victorian Legal Aid and within the courts to embed this sort of information into the judiciary processes. So there's been a development of new model conferencing, so much greater emphasis on dispute resolution, and that's bearing some fruit, I think. So we're working at all sorts of levels, really, trying to improve the way these matters are understood within the legal sector. There's also the Children's Court Clinic is undergoing radical change and will be relocated. Within child protection, there's we got some money to have, I think, about 20 positions dedicated to permanent care and stability. Because one of the critique from the Cummins was that, in fact, for those children who require long-term care, it takes way too long to make those decisions. And children bounce in and out of the court system too long. So much greater understanding, it's a sort of an action research. So that's where we're interviewing literally for those positions at the moment. Additional funding, as I've already talked about, for the therapeutic residential care, so that's the extra 100 beds. And zero fee training places for young people leaving care, because that's the other vulnerable group, you know, the 18 to 21-year-olds who are actually coming out of the out-of-home care system. And really important that we support these young people. You know, it breaks my heart, we talk about preparing kids at 15, 16 for independent living. Like, do your kids pick up the towel off the floor when they're 15? Let alone know how to cook and budget and what have you. So, you know, society's changed, hasn't it? Our adults' kids are living at home longer, aren't they? So we need to actually shift the way that government as parent actually looks after these older kids. There will be a complementary 5-year plan for Aboriginal children in out-of-home care, and people are meeting and starting to draft that up as we speak, and that'll be a work in progress over the next few years. And the whole collective resources of government was the common phrase in Cummins, needing to work together. There's a new commission for children and young people. okay, including a Aboriginal Commissioner. So that's Bernie Geary's office. There'll be a strengthened role for the Children's Services Coordination Board. So many of you would know about that board. So that's going to have a more prominent role. These are all recommendations coming out of Cummins that have been taken up. And more effective and use of data and data sharing across programs and departments was a big theme as well. I just want you to wanted to point out the co-occurrence between the presence of family violence and incidents of child abuse, because we often tend to think of them as discrete categories. In fact, some other studies would say there's a 15 times greater likelihood of the child being directly abused if there's partner violence. And in Victoria, it's estimated 1 in 4 children will have been exposed to or experienced family violence before their 18th birthday. And I said that recently at a paediatric conference, and one of them got up and he said, "But that would be an epidemic. That can't be right." I said, "Well, that's right. The stats are there." So we've got really, really good information about that. So again, it's about working smarter. If you understand that, you're going to have a much greater awareness for the impact on the child. I just want to reassure anybody working with adolescents that it's not all over Red Rover. It's those first 4 years are critical. But we know adolescence, again, is a time of huge neural plasticity and neural pruning and growth. There's a tremendous opportunity, if you like, a real window again. Now, it's very, I think, there's lots of myths around about adolescents that they need to separate out. The research says those adolescents who are most healthy are actually those who are most connected to family, culture, community. And the healing power of connection to Aboriginal culture I can't stress enough. So the importance in working with partnerships, seeking advice from cultural consultants, but enabling us to have that mindset that if you look at the resilience research in the literature, those kids who are most resilient are those where there's greater connection. So that sort of myth around storm and stress in adolescence is exactly that. Most kids actually go through, 80% will go through very well. And those 20% who are struggling generally have had gross difficulties earlier on. Okay, so there's generally a history of trauma earlier on that was perhaps where there were perhaps missed opportunities. In terms of what works, and Gregory and George are going to talk about that, and we've got workshops in the afternoon. But you cannot get away from your role and the relationship-based practice that we know worldwide comes across all the research, that the single greatest determinant of good outcomes for children in the child protection and family services area is in fact the quality of the relationship that the professional forms with the child and the family. It's not about the model, it's not about it's actually about your relationship. Now, interestingly enough, I told you my husband's in education. The same thing is coming through in the education research about quality teaching. It's about the relationship that teachers form with students. My nursing friends, when I look at their research, again, in terms of outcomes, the quality of the relationship between the nurse and the family. So again and again, we cannot get away from that humanity, the warmth, the compassion, the commitment, you demonstrating that you'll be reliable, that you'll get back on the phone call, that you'll actually help them get the fridge fixed and understand that their most top of mind worry right now is they haven't got anywhere to live. Not that they've just been swearing at their child, you know? Like, you have to start where they're at and actually be practically supportive and earn your stripes, because you don't know what they've gone through in their life and the ghosts from the past that are still haunting them probably in their heads. So we've actually developed, and I know we've got to stop in a minute for morning tea, but we've developed a number of resources that are available online. And that best interest case practice model, which looks like this, we've just redeveloped. It's got quite a bit in there about risk assessment. But the three key things that you've got to be worried about with parents is where they've got stuck beliefs that aren't changing. You've tried to engage them, but they still think that clip around the ears is what that kid deserves, or that child's personally out to get them. So where you get those stuck beliefs, that's a real problem. Where you have a huge pattern and history, where you know there's been other partners, other kids in care, the pattern and history matters. The greatest predictor of future behaviour is in fact past behaviour. So very important that we're forensically astute as well as strength-based. Okay, we've got to work with people's strengths. That's how we begin the engagement process. But we've got to be smart about it. And where you have disguised compliance is the third area that you've got to keep a radar out for. Where you actually have parents who will say, yes, no worries, I'll do that. They'll go to one interview or one session somewhere, maybe miss a couple, then go to one other, and that sort of looks like they're changing. But in fact, we can get carried away and swept up because we all want the happy ending, we want the family to stay together. But in fact, it could be exactly that, disguised compliance, and in fact, nothing's changing for the child. So to really make sure that all of us have that notion of understanding those alarm bells that you need to have in your head and the radar that should be there. And any bruising on a baby that's not crawling, for goodness sake, get a medical that day, and a forensic medical at that. Okay, it is not normal. Facial bruising on little kids, normally, if it's, you need to be really curious if there's other sorts of bruising on the child. It should not be swept aside, and we shouldn't be naively believing sort of poor excuses. So we do need to hold a position of understanding the rights of children that can't speak for themselves. We know adult sex offenders mostly started offending in their younger years, okay, in adolescence. But it's not true that most adolescents with sexually abusive behaviours go on to become adult offenders. In fact, treatment is incredibly hopeful and very positive, and there are low recidivism rates. We know we can turn around and make safer communities if we work earlier with children with these problems. So we've got about 10 of these resources. They're all available to you free of charge. You can download or try and get some hard copies.